Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving into this controversial idea about how Luke Acts functioned almost like a gospel peace treaty, putting together a fractured church.
Yeah. So this whole notion, it's saying that Luke Acts, far from being a simple historical account, was actually a sort of narrative patch-up job for early Christianity, right?
Exactly. It's like, a strategic countermeasure. The idea is that during the second century, Christianity wasn't this unified movement. It was split into factions. We've got Pauline Christians, Jewish Christians loyal to figures like James and Peter, Gnostic mystics, and this radical group following Marcion.
Right. So instead of a single canon holding everything together, there was this, power struggle over whose version of Jesus and gospel story would prevail.
Precisely. And here's where it gets interesting. Around 140 CE, Marcion, who was super radical in his own right, released what is considered the first New Testament canon. His version, presented a Jesus who just appears suddenly, already grown up with no birth narrative or Jewish background.
Right. And in his teachings, he also rejected the Old Testament, seeing that God is a lower, angry kind of demiurge. It's like he basically threw out the whole Jewish context.
Exactly. And that posed a big crisis for the emerging proto-Orthodox Church. Here, the bishops and leaders were alarmed by his theology that emphasized radical grace without the covenant and prophecy elements that tied Jesus to Jewish tradition.
Yep. So then they sort of fought back with Luke Acts to reestablish their narrative continuity with the Jewish scriptures, correct?
Right. Luke was, in many ways, a direct response to Marcion's version. It deliberately includes elements like the virgin birth, Jesus' descent from David, quotes from Isaiah, and actual fulfillment of Mosaic prophecy.
In a sense, it's like they were saying, look, our Jesus is deeply rooted in Jewish tradition, not some floating out of nowhere idea.
Absolutely. And then there's Acts, which takes this reconciliation even further by presenting Peter and Paul not as bitter rivals, but as partners in spreading the gospel. It's like a huge narrative pacifier.
Right. But here's a thought. Don't you think it's a bit idealized? I mean, Paul himself wrote in Galatians about conflicts with Peter and the Jerusalem church.
That's a solid point. And that's exactly what makes this theory so provocative. Acts, as we know it, is not so much a historical archive but a crafted piece of damage control. It essentially rewrites the internal strife to manufacture unity.
Exactly. So, in this view, Luke Acts becomes less about recording what really happened and more about, presenting a version of history that could sort of bind divided communities together by suppressing the real conflicts.
Right on point. It's like they took the messy truth of doctrinal disputes and reworked it into a tidy narrative, a sort of peace treaty in literary form.
Yep, and the dating of these texts is, crucial here. Traditional scholars say Luke Acts were written around 80 to 90 CE, but new research proposes they might actually have been composed as late as 170 to 180 CE.
Exactly. And that's what scholars like Matthias Klinghardt and Jason Bedun, and even Joseph Tyson, suggest. It's a real paradigm shift, arguing that these texts were a response to Marcion's explosive challenge in a second-century context.
So, if the texts were written so late, it implies that early Christianity was still grappling with these factional identities well into the 2nd century, right?
Yes, exactly. And this reshaping isn't just on a superficial level. It's reshaping nothing less than the identity of Paul himself. In the letters, Paul is depicted as fiery, independent. Yet in Luke Acts, he's portrayed, almost sanitized, to fit with a unified apostolic narrative.
That contrast really draws the line. Paul's own accounts in Galatians are in stark contradiction with the harmonious depiction of his relationship with Peter in Acts.
Yeah, exactly. It's as if the authors of Luke Acts intentionally diluted Paul's confrontational tone to support this grand narrative of unity, which was needed desperately to counter Marcion's disruptive ideas.
And speaking of Marcion, isn't it fascinating how his radical reinterpretation of the divine created such a ripple effect? I mean, rejecting the law, the prophets, it was, total upheaval.
Oh, definitely. Marcion's approach was like a lightning bolt. Suddenly, he introduced a version of the gospel that on one hand was incredibly appealing to Gentiles, but on the other hand threatened the established order of Jewish heritage that the proto-Orthodox Church was building.
Yeah, and it was this threat that forced the hand of the church leaders to, in a way, rewrite their narrative to, reassert their authority and vision.
Exactly. It's almost like a literary counteroffensive. Imagine if a sports team, after a shocking defeat, rewrites the playbook to showcase an invincible strategy. They do this solely to obscure the chaos of the game.
I get that analogy. That's a cool way to put it. So the gospel here isn't just about divine history. It's also very political, aiming to unify and legitimize the prevailing narrative in a time of crisis.
Yes, and let's not forget Acts' role here. It crafts a version where Peter, the archetypal Jew, has a vision that makes him accept Gentiles, effectively erasing a controversial past and establishing a unified church image.
Exactly. But here's something I ponder. Why would the church choose to erase these conflicts rather than confront them head-on? Isn't there a risk in rewriting history like this?
That's a very good question. One perspective is that the church needed a functional narrative, a story that could sustain its growing influence. If the early church were known for its messy internal disputes, its claim to divine authority might have been undermined.
I see that. So, essentially, it's as if they traded raw accuracy for a cohesive tradition that would bind the community together, even if that meant sacrificing some historical details.
Exactly. It was a compromise, a deliberate, crafted version of the truth that ultimately prioritized unity and legitimacy over a candid account of past conflicts.
Right. And interestingly, the textual evidence supports this reinterpretation of timing. The Muratorian fragment, for instance, mentions Acts in a rather defensive tone, placing its composition later than traditionally thought.
Absolutely. And scholars like Markus Vinzent and Richard Purvo even label Acts as a theological novel, emphasizing that its primary role was to stitch together a controlled narrative that best served the church's interests.
Yeah. I can imagine, then, that while many Christians celebrate the familiar narratives of shepherds, angels, and apostles as historical accounts, what they're actually engaging with might partly be a form of early propaganda crafted to silence dissent.
Exactly. It's unsettling when you think about it. What if those cherished stories were, in part, constructed to present a unified front by, say, silencing the rebellious voices of the other factions?
Yeah, that's kind of mind-blowing. It really puts into perspective how all these elements, the gospel narratives, the historical dating issues, and even the depiction of key figures like Paul and Peter, serve a dual purpose, both conveying theology and, more strategically, mending a broken church.
Right. It's a powerful reminder that history and theology are not always clear-cut. Sometimes the texts we revere emerge from, really complex political and social circumstances.
Absolutely. And that complexity makes us, question the nature of authority in the early church. Did these leaders have to, as uncomfortable as it might be, rewrite history to ensure survival? Or could they have done it differently?
That's a tough one. On one hand, you see the pragmatic need for unity in a time of deep division, but on the other, it does raise ethical questions about, manipulating truth to create consensus.
That debate. So, wrapping it up, Luke Acts isn't just a set of historical texts. It's a complex synthesis, a carefully edited narrative designed to unify what was once a deeply fractured community. Truly fascinating stuff.
Absolutely, and it shows just how intertwined history, theology, and politics can be. If you ever find this paradoxical mix as intriguing as we do, keep questioning and digging deeper. Isn't that what makes exploring these texts so, endlessly captivating?
Indeed.